This episode is a continuation of the last episode, where we discussed the relationship between language and our reality. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into it.
And now, let's have a look at two questions. Does reality shape language, or does language shape our reality? Well, we actually also raised this question in the last part of the previous episode, so yeah, let's just have a look. And I guess let's just have a look at the latter question. To what extent does language shape our reality? It is evident that right now we're speaking English, one of the most commonly spoken languages in the world. So now, let's travel to the continent of Africa, to northern Namibia and southern Angola, to the Himba Tribe, and explore a language spoken by only 50,000 people in the world. Colors. What are colors? Scientifically speaking, they are wavelengths of visible light, and every different color has a specific wavelength. So, in theory, colors, being such an objective and measurable concept, should be perceived in the same way for most of the non-colorblind human beings, right? However, researchers found that the Himba people's perception of color is different from ours. From their language, they grouped colors slightly differently than English. While we have color groups like red, pink, yellow, orange, green, blue, etc., the Himbas only have 5 color groups. And let's have a look at 3 of them. First, the color group Dambu, which includes a variety of green, red, and yellow colors. The second group Zuzu includes dark colors like dark green. And the third group, Buru, is used for certain green and blue colors. So, as you can see, while the English language grouped different shades of green under the same color group, the Himbas have 3 separate groups for them. And on the other hand, in English, green colors and blue colors are 2 different categories. However, the Himba language, certain green and blue colors belong to the same color group, Buru. Remember that viral Instagram filter colorblind, where people try to spot the circle with a color that is shown in a different shade than the rest? Researchers conducted a test similar to that Instagram filter to a group of monolingual Himbas, and they found that the Himbas are able to quickly spot out a different shade of green, while most of us English-speaking people can't. And when they showed the Himbas 11 green tiles and 1 blue tile, it took them way longer to spot that blue tile, while most of us could easily see the different one. I mean, just imagine this. It's definitely going to be harder for you to spot the difference between royal blue and cobalt blue than sky blue and lime green, as royal blue and cobalt blue are just different shades of the same color group, blue. So for the Himbas, it will be significantly harder to spot the difference between green and blue, as to them and their language, these 2 colors are just different shades of the same color group, Buru. And this is interesting, as something so seemingly objective, like colors, could be perceived very differently due to a difference in language. And if you want to know more about what we talked about in terms of how language shapes our reality, you can check out the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or linguistic determinism, which states that our language will define and confine our thoughts and culture, and linguistic relativism, which is a principle that states the particular language one speaks influences the way one thinks about reality, which is a weaker statement of linguistic determinism. I will put some links down in the description. So yeah, Joshua, can you think of any instances in which language can change how you see reality? And like also the fact that you're bilingual, how does that change your perceptions on things, let's say color?
Yes, I think as you mentioned, I'm bilingual in Chinese, predominantly Cantonese and English,
Yeah.
and I think they describe colors really differently, and this can be seen through the vocabularies they use when describing color. So in Cantonese, colors actually has a tactile quality to it. And as well as some sort of emotional expression or attachment, of which they um, kind of tint their vocabularies with. So in Chinese, let's say we're trying to talk about the color white. So we actually have 白雪雪 and 白茫茫. And the Basusu actually means snowy white or some variations of that, and it has the kind of connotation of really pretty and bright and kind of fluffy kind of white, so very similar to that of snow. And on the other hand, Bat Mong Mong, while also describing the color white, it kind of has this meaning similar to misty white. So something that's really ash-like, very gloomy, perhaps like a color that you would use to describe a kind of really misty afternoon, or something you're going to describe a kind of perhaps a very um, melancholic kind of mood. So uh, or we can also argue that in English, we also use some extent of that. So as I mentioned before, you can also use snowy white or misty white. But to me, those seems a little more forced because I guess you're only attaching a metaphor simile in front of the color. At first, as opposed to in Cantonese, the color and metaphor are literally fused into a group of like vocabularies that are specifically used in some context or some kind of illusion that you want to create. So I guess as you mentioned, the way of how we use colors are on one hand it could be some can argue that it's reflective of how we see different things across culture. So for example, for example, in Chinese, we're known as a high context culture. So we're known to speak things more, perhaps more metaphorically, or we don't really directly say what we're thinking. So perhaps the language we use are also more flowery and more fancy. Versus in English, so a language predominantly used in the Western world, of which a lot of their cultures are low context cultures, so they're more direct in the way they speak. So perhaps when they talk about color, they only mean the color itself, rather than trying to attach extra metaphors or extra qualities to it that they deem unnecessary. So I guess to answer your question, I think language does alter the way we see reality, and that could be shown through how we use language to express different colors and how we use language to basically communicate with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with your point on like the, sometimes in terms of the colors that we speak in Chinese, we also inject some of the connotations, like our feelings inside, like 苍白 or like the ones that you mentioned just now. So it's definitely very different from how, I guess in English, how we describe colors. Even though I do understand, like, in English literature classes, we're always like being like, oh, the writer uses the word blue, which means that he's feeling melancholic on certain things, just having random meanings in we are doing literature analysis. I understand we do have that, but yeah, and a lot of colors that we just use in daily conversations, like they will also have that connotation of how we think. And I guess another interesting point in just now, that kind of narrative that I just presented in the Himba culture tribe language example that I just presented, is that the Himba language is only spoken by 50,000 people in the world. And it's true that there's a lot of languages and dialects that are only spoken by just a very small number of people, and they're also slowly disappearing because of urbanization that happens around the world. So to me, I guess the fundamental purpose of language is communication, like English, Mandarin, Cantonese. These languages, though, they all allow me to get exposed to so many more ideas and thoughts from different people with different backgrounds and culture. However, I also believe that language is so much more than just communication. Like in the Himba language, you can see so much on perceptions in us human beings, different dialects, or even regional specific vocabulary. It tells you a lot about a community and culture. So Joshua, what are your thoughts on the significance of language and also conserving them, and also how languages are disappearing and what we should do to kind of preserve the cultural aspect that has within language?
Yes, on the one hand, I've seen people arguing of how because if we see language as purely a vessel of communication, once language has been phased out, there is actually no value of which we should which we should be conserving, because when a vessel loses its functions, it's basically useless. But to me, I think that we can actually observe a lot from language. So language is actually very reflective of how people think, or how society is at a time period. So I guess looking at obsolete or historical language actually has the value of allowing us to peer into the lives of people who lived before us, and I think that's it's very interesting, especially in the terms of academia point of view. So and I think that it is such a great pity that we are not able to understand how people from hundreds of years ago uses language, especially verbal ones, because some of the dialects has already faded out. And as you can see, historians and archaeologists actually are working hard to really retrieve those dialects that people used long ago. So to me, I think that if there's really no language and no value in these languages, these experts and these professionals will not be really excavating so hard or spending so much effort and time in trying to revive these long lost language. So I do think that, to answer your question, I do think that there is great value in trying to revive or perhaps conserve or preserve lost or obsolete language.
Wow, that's so nice. Because, yeah, I never thought about the temporal aspect. I was just thinking about the spatial one. Like, throughout different geographical locations, we have different dialects. So, yeah, that's so cool. Like, to think about, people back then, how were they talking? Like, because in Chinese, we have, like, 文言文, right? So, like, just people, the written ones from, like, hundreds of years ago. But then honestly, it's so interesting, right? Like, to see how they are talking back then. I mean, just think about how we are talking right now. Vibe, lit, like all of these words. I'm pretty sure people back then won't even know what we're talking about with all of these strange vocabulary. So yeah, I think language in terms of the temporal aspect definitely will tell us so much more about what happened at their time, and just like peering into ordinary life, it's definitely going to tell us a lot of information about history, and I think that's a really cool thing.
Yeah, and because you mentioned, like, other than the culture, there's also the kind of, I guess, as you mentioned, like the spatial aspect of language. And yeah, I think that when they mention English is a mongrel language, like how
Yeah.
very, like, I know, very secondary extended essay kind of vibes. But when we talk about how language is able to transcend all these spatial disparity and act as a vessel of which we as we mentioned, that contains all the different cultures that we've seen, as well as as a way of which we're able to unite different communities, or perhaps like as the power to act as a common basis of which different people can come together and communicate and exchange ideas with each other. And I think that's a very impressive sort of achievement made possible by language. So I think that further shows the power, or rather the significance, of language.
Right. I mean, yeah, speaking of the cultural implications of language, maybe we could have a look at the question, to what extent does reality shape our language? And yeah, we've talked about something similar to this in the previous episode. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? So let's have a look at the other way around. So when I was thinking about this question, I actually thought of the Little Mermaid, Ariel. In her song, Part of Your World, she sings, walking around on those, what do you call them? Oh, feet. And what's a fire, and what's the word? Burn. And of course, in her world, her reality, there isn't such a thing as feet or fire. So naturally, in her language, she wouldn't have such vocabulary. This kind of exhibits how reality can shape our language. So let's go back to the time when language was invented. I thought about the differences between English and Chinese vocabulary and the reasons behind their differences. The first example I want to raise is the different yous in Chinese. There's only one word for you in English, and that's basically you. However, there are two words for you in Chinese, 你 and 您, which the latter is more formal with the connotation of respect, typically used by someone with a lower status to a higher one or a younger person to an older person. And additionally, it's also used very differently among different regions in China. For example, I think it's not used that often in Hong Kong, but it's used quite often in Beijing. And sometimes when we say it, it's kind of sarcastic as well. And also doing some research, I also found that there are also many other ways to say you in Japanese, depending on gender, relationship with the person you're referring to, politeness, status, etc. And another example I can think of are all the titles for family relatives. For example, in English, there's only one term, and that is uncle. And yet in Chinese, there are all sorts of different names for different uncles. Your mother's younger brother has their own title. Older brother has a different one. Dad's younger brother and older brother all have very different names and titles. And yeah, also I find it really confusing where, you see like Western TV shows and they just call their uncles by their first name. I find that really distressing because that's never gonna happen for a Chinese household. And so I also wondered, why is this case? Why is there different yous in Chinese and different names for uncles in Chinese? And I kind of took a guess, and I believe it's the deep-rooted Confucianism philosophy and system that has been a core of Chinese society for thousands of years. And without a doubt, Confucianism has also influenced many other societies in East Asia. A fundamental core for Confucian's philosophy is respect for your parents, loyalty for the government, and doing the best you can for your own responsibilities. There's a huge emphasis on a hierarchy of status in families and schools and the society, which is impossible to change in a person's lifetime. And I guess even becoming the emperor is kind of like a destiny. So if you're a farmer, just do your best at your responsibilities. If you're a student, respect your teacher, and so on and so forth. However, let's take a look one step deeper. Why does this Confucian system thrive in a society like China for so long? It's almost impossible for me to think that a Western country will ever adopt a Confucian philosophy. And I also took a guess, and I guess the geography of China plays a significant role. As a civilization that started in the Huanghe Valley, where most communities survive on agriculture, it is important to have a large family and stay close with the family members, as manpower is needed when it comes to agricultural processes, and hence it's important for survival. Unity is also highly valued as people benefit from staying together. Also, another thing is that the weather is also much valued, because a bad weather could ruin your months of hard work at the farm. Therefore, stability and the idea of fate, which is kind of like 老天爷, which I guess directly translates to old sky master. And these are kind of ideas that are much valued in an agricultural society like China. So, going back to the question, how does reality shape our language? I guess from the examples that are raised, it is evident that the geographical reality of China shaped much of the Chinese philosophy and hence its language and vocabulary. So Joshua, I know you're a Chinese history expert, so yeah, feel free to add on anything and or your thoughts on the two examples I raised. Like, what do you think about this, and also my speculations on how geography and the philosophy impacts the language?
Yes, I haven't really investigated that much about the history of language, especially in the context of Chinese society. And I think one thing that I've really one thing that I came across is that in Chinese culture throughout dynastical Chinese history, we actually written Chinese is actually very different from how we how we speak languages. So
Yes.
this makes it really difficult for commoners to really be able to engage in academia and be able to share their thoughts, since in order to write good language, you will have to go through really formal training. You have to have a educational background. In order to do that, you will have to in order to do that, you'll have to be able to afford that. So you have to come from a very rich family. You have to have enough power to do that.
Yeah.
So I guess we can see how the use of language is able to concentrate power into the powerful few or the elite. But I guess when the revolution came, and how when China enters the 20th and 21st century,
Yeah.
this started to change as we started to write language as how we say, how we speak in everyday
Yes.
life. So in Chinese, there's this phrase called 好少say好, so like
Mm.
how our hand is writing what our mouth is saying. So I guess this shows how language is used as a tool to how can I put this? I guess from this you can see how nowadays language is made more available to to the mass public, and hence it's able to disperse that kind of power
Yeah.
amongst the commoners, and people are able to to rise through the ranks, or be able to achieve social mobility through using their language and expressing their unique thoughts, and be able to perhaps monetize that, or be able to
Yeah.
yeah, or be able to gain the necessary education to perhaps pursue in academia, or other applications in society. So I guess
Yeah.
it shows how a language we're able to how language is able to I guess concentrate power as well as disperse it. So, and this has been backed by historical evidence.
Yeah. Oh wow, that is such a good point. Yeah, that is so true. Like how, language can be very exclusive. And I guess before I forget, I wanted to add the point on like, how 就是白话文 kind of like nowadays are what we are writing is basically what we're speaking. But I find that very different for Cantonese, but because we still have the Haoyu version of certain languages in Cantonese, this particular dialect, which I think is super cool. And like, also I think Cantonese is also pretty old because there's a lot of those kind of older Chinese language speaking methods like 倒装词 or something like that. So yeah, I just feel like it's really cool, like this particular dialect, and this, I mean, I started to learn it when I was 11, and it was so hard, but then it was pretty fun and interesting at the very end, and I was able to tap into, a brand new language and like a different, I guess, culture among the Chinese society. And I guess the second point I really wanted to like relate with the points that you're making is how like language is able to differentiate like different statuses or different levels in like the hierarchy. And I think it has been that way because it's such a powerful way to control people. I think that is also like a really fundamental core on like just, I don't even think that is a bad thing. I think that is just a Chinese culture thing. Like it's just a habit, which it sucks honestly because you're able to create that different differentiation. Like I know this information and you do not. So this gap with knowledge, and hence it makes people quite easy to control. And I think it doesn't just apply to Chinese languages, but a lot of this jargon situation in many academic fields. I think when I was first having this thought like of specific jargons and just how stupid it is possibly in business and economics. It's just like these concepts you can just simply explain like quantitative easing. It's not a very difficult concept, but you just have to frame it with a very fancy term so then those old white men could have exclusive knowledge access to these things and you don't know what they're talking about. Of course, in politics as well, these politicians use very fancy words and then they just make themselves look very knowledgeable, make you not understand what the policy is about. So yeah, I think jargons and this knowledge gap, which is largely intentional. We're definitely going to talk more about that in future episodes, like the so-called the affair, the grievance study. And I just think it's so fun that you brought this up.
Yeah. So like, yeah, I guess this shows how like back to our topic of language and how
Yeah.
it's able to shape reality. And as you mentioned, like how throughout a lot of throughout the history and throughout a lot of like evidence, as we've mentioned in all these kind of podcast throughout this podcast and the last one, we're able to see how language has a very monumental role in our establishment of human society, and how we're able to advance throughout from caveman era to perhaps like the scientific era we live in today of the
Yeah.
20th and 21st centuries.
Also on the differences with vocabulary, because I want to talk about this because I'm very interested in like feminism ideas. So just now we talked about like different use in Chinese and also different titles for like uncles. I guess another one I wanted to bring out is genders in certain words, because with our 3-year experience in French learning at school, which I don't really remember.
Horrible.
Yeah, I mean it's a fun experience, but yeah,
Fun.
yeah, you can see that there's a lot of genders in French or Spanish words. Like many languages with Latin roots, they also have like masculine, feminine, or neuter terms and vocabulary. Like a boat is feminine, or there's a lot of feminine things, I think. But then in Chinese, like even for like he, she, it, they, all of these like pronouns, they're actually all pronounced the same way as ta or tamen for a plural number of people, so like referring to they. And also, the female written ta wasn't even invented in the recent 100 years. So it's just kind of interesting on this emphasis with gender in one language and also the lack of emphasis of it in the other. So yeah, I mean, I just kind of feel like there's definitely a lot of similarities and differences between like these two cultures. The idea of feminism, female status are all being explored throughout history in both China and also the places that speak, languages like French or Spanish. And however, I feel like just focusing on the point where the female written ta wasn't invented in the recent 100 years, we kind of can see like this later realization for women in China of their status. And I guess potentially it can also be due to like cultural aspects of unity, or like, as a woman, you should just follow your responsibilities and there's a less emphasis on individuality compared with the West. So yeah, Joshua, I just wanted to know like your opinions on the differences between these two languages and the genders relating them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that always puzzled me when I was learning these languages. I think some, for same now, for example, like a table or a car, I think they have different genders according to the different languages you're using. So I'm not sure, but correct me if I'm wrong. But I think I saw some examples that are like that, and to me, it's I never really investigated why, but to me it always seems like an odd thing. As you
Yeah.
mentioned, in China we don't really do that. Like even the female, like the word she doesn't really has not arise until the kind of feminist movement in modern China. So I guess this also as we mentioned before, I guess it also kind of reflects language values in terms of the cultural world of how it's able to embody the different values shared between different cultures. So perhaps in the mystical China were more like we're more discriminatory towards like females, so we're more sexist. So so we kind of negate the use of the female versions of things in literature. And
Yeah.
I guess it also kind of shows, how a culture or a country is able to progress through time, as in the more recent times where we adapted to use the more feminized version of the she and he. So so I think really it's really showing of the different values embodied in the different cultures. So perhaps it shows how language is able to once again be a mirror to humanity and be able to reflect the different values that are embodied between different cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, I think just the absence of the female ta, or like just, the it ta, the he ta, the she ta, they're all the same. I think it can tell you that like this is a culture that doesn't really care about gender, or like it can also tell you that it's so male centered, like it's so
Yeah.
centered around one particular gender, that like throughout history is basically all about that. Like, it's possible. I guess we can definitely do some more research on that if we have time. So
Oh,
yeah,
I want to add one more thing. It reminded
sure.
me, in Chinese, we actually have a ta for God as well. Like we use the like a I don't know how to say in English, like the 保守, which is like we use like
Oh,
a this thing.
oh,
Sorry,
is
I
it the
don't really know how to
Bible
describe.
one?
Yeah, the Bible one,
Yeah,
exactly. But
yeah.
it's so weird because supposedly Christianity is a religion that is
Right,
imported from Western culture, but in Western
right.
culture we use he to talk about God instead. So it also features this really perhaps male centric. I don't know if I'm crossing some religious lines here, but like it's kind of like more centered towards the
Yeah,
male world, versus in Chinese culture we kind of want
yeah.
to make God as
Interesting.
like a special entity that transcends
Mm,
genders or sex. So we give a
right.
special I guess a pronoun to God
Mm,
himself. So I guess this kind of renders my argument of how Chinese culture is completely male centric. It renders
right.
this argument moot because
Mm,
of how we also try to invent, I guess, new pronouns or new words that
yeah,
um try to transcend gender and try to
yeah,
stay neutral in terms of I guess genders and
yeah.
nouns, which to me is still a bizarre concept. I'm sorry. Even with like
Yeah,
3 years of
true.
French, yeah.
True, and like also the idea of pronouns, I think it's kind of more prominent because, um, like now we're becoming more aware of the LGBTQ plus family and also the pronouns that people prefer. And I guess that is also one of the possible ones, even though that's not largely related to the topic of um, language, but I think is also closely related to it. So I guess this is the end of our episode, and thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you next time on the Uncommon Senses.